Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and welcome to Fully Equipped. It's the late 50s AD and Paul is in some trouble with the Jews again. He's out of the frying pan and into the fire. In chapters 23 and 24, we read about Paul's defense in front of the Sanhedrin, the Jews plotting to assassinate him, and his time in custody under Felix. We see God's gentle encouragement to Paul as Paul faces a lot of hard situations. Jesus is present with Paul, just as he promised he would be. We see Paul's heart for both Jews and Gentiles to know the beautiful gospel. And we see as God is leading Paul ever closer towards Rome. Through it all, God is present, sovereign, and ultimately, he's growing his church. Chapter 23 shows how Paul is in front of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. He tries to defend himself in front of them, but Ananias orders him to be struck on the mouth. Ananias proves himself time and time again to be a bad high priest. Leviticus 19 talks about how injustice in the court is illegal under God's law. Jewish law considered people innocent until proven guilty. Ananias is not holding to these things. Paul hasn't even been charged yet, let alone convicted of anything. In response to this, Paul gets angry and declares that God is going to strike Ananias. This might be kind of prophetic because Ananias actually got murdered by some revolutionaries about 10 years later. Paul also calls him a whitewashed wall, something Jesus also said to describe someone who is a hypocrite. They look good on the outside, but inwardly they're not structurally sound. Some people say that Paul said this out of holy, righteous anger. Some people say that Paul wasn't being led by the Holy Spirit. But it turns out that Paul wasn't aware that Ananias was the high priest, or perhaps he didn't know who the command to strike him had come from. He quotes from Exodus chapter 22, where God commands the people not to curse their leaders. In quoting from the law like this, Paul shows that he's submitted to the will of God, even though they're putting him on trial for not doing so. Paul realizes that this group of people is never going to listen to him. So, in noticing that there is a mix of Pharisees and Sadducees present, he leads the people into an argument over resurrection. The Pharisees end up siding with Paul, and the Sadducees stand in opposition to him. When the Jews become violent over this disagreement, the tribune takes Paul away. No decision can be made about him when the Jews are in this state. And that night, Jesus meets with Paul to encourage him. Jesus tells Paul to take courage because Jerusalem is not where Paul's story ends. He's going to go to Rome, and there he will testify about Jesus as well. This is another occasion where God shows up to Paul when he's at a point where he could become incredibly discouraged. Last time, this happened in Corinth. Now we see how God is encouraging Paul, even though he's not taking him out of this sticky situation. And as we follow Paul over the final few years of his life, we can see that it's encouragement like this from God that kept him going. The truth and the power of the gospel, as well as the presence of God, enabled him to continue testifying even when it got hard. And that's the same Jesus who is available to us and present with us wherever we go. After Paul's time in front of the Sanhedrin, we read about how the Jews plot to assassinate him. They're going to pretend to the Romans that they want to examine him a bit more, but whilst he's on the road, they plan to ambush and kill him. By the blessing of God, Paul's nephew hears about it, and they get word to the Roman tribune. The tribune prepares hundreds of soldiers to go and protect Paul as he travels. Actually, it's possible that the amount of soldiers Lysias sent was about half of his entire cohort in Jerusalem. So Paul is kept safe as he is brought to Caesarea to be put on trial before the Roman governor Felix. Lysias also writes a letter to Felix, saying that he doesn't find Paul guilty of anything concerning Roman law. Paul is only being accused by the Jews because they think he's breaking their law. That's a common theme as Paul is accused throughout the rest of Acts. The Romans always see him as innocent. In chapter 24, we read about Paul in Caesarea, where he ends up being imprisoned for over 2 years. Ananias, the high priest, arrives in Caesarea 5 days later, and the Jews lay out their case against Paul. He's accused of stirring up riots and being a cult leader. They say that he's even trying to profane the temple. Paul defends himself by saying that he doesn't stir up riots, and that the Jews have no evidence of him doing so. He's only been in Jerusalem for less than 2 weeks. How would he have had time to stir up a following? What he does confess to is worshipping God and obeying his word. He has faith that one day God will raise all people to be judged. He believes in the same God as the Jews, and he lives as a faithful Jew. He shares that he had come to Jerusalem to bring a gift for the poor people in Jerusalem. This is the collection he had been taking up at the churches on his missionary journeys. He's hardly profaning the temple if he actually went to offer gifts there. Paul's accusers aren't actually present, so he calls for them to confront him face to face. The Jews who are present at the moment cannot testify to the things that he's actually being accused of. He wasn't found guilty of anything when he was in front of the Sanhedrin. And he wasn't the one who caused the violence between the Sanhedrin. All he did was say that he believed in the resurrection. Through all of Paul's defense, it's so powerful that he never complains or speaks out of bitterness. Sure, he defends himself strongly, but he's never wallowing in self-pity or trying to get revenge. I think that if I was treated as poorly as he was, I would get defensive and bitter. But Paul's example is so powerful that we can defend ourselves in a way that is righteous and firm without getting all woe is me. And Paul is mistreated even further. The Roman governor Felix says that he'll wait for Lysias to arrive so that he can hear further testimony and then decide what to do. Paul is locked away but does have some freedoms. Paul actually gets the chance to share the gospel with Felix and his Jewish wife Drusilla. Felix is alarmed when he hears the gospel. God is coming to judge all people, including powerful people like Felix. Paul is sent away with the promise that Felix will summon him. But instead of giving Paul justice, he keeps Paul locked up for another 2 years. After this time, he's fired and replaced by Festus. And in order to make the Jews happy, Felix leaves Paul in prison. So we leave chapter 24 with not a lot of hope for Paul. He seems to be stuck in a really bad place. But it's encouraging to know that God hadn't abandoned Paul in these 2 years. It wasn't like God wasn't using and growing Paul in this time. I wonder if Paul ever questioned God's promise to him that he would testify in Rome while he was stuck in prison for those 2 years. It would have been really easy to doubt God. But even though he wasn't traveling around the world preaching the gospel, God was still at work. And we'll see God continue to be at work as we finish up reading Acts over the next few days. How does this equip us? Is it possible to be angry and yet to not sin? Paul says it is. And we see him live that out in today's section. It's amazing to see him take on everything that the Jews throw at him, and yet never curse them or curse God. It would have been easy for him to get angry, throw blame at God, or speak harshly to the Jews. It would have been easy to give up on his mission to bring the gospel to the people who had treated him so cruelly. But Paul doesn't seem to sin, even when he gets angry and has to defend himself over and over again in the face of slander and abuse. In the world we live in today, anger is everywhere. It only takes a quick scroll on Instagram to see comments spewing violent hate over meaningless things. Many people never actually learn how to express or manage anger, and may have had poor examples of doing so from their parents. Traumatic experiences, lack of a sense of belonging, medical problems, and other things can cause anger problems in people. Sometimes anger is caused by demonic oppression connected to a sin or a curse. So how do we learn to process anger? There are many ways to go about this, and it will depend on the situation. But we have to take responsibility for our anger when we allow it to get out of control and become sin. We need to find ways to stop ourselves from stewing in anger, because ruminating often makes us more and more angry. We need to see confronting our anger as spiritual warfare. Choosing not to act in anger when it's all we want to do is fighting the will of the enemy. If it's a really serious or ongoing issue for us, we need to seek counseling and prayer. Jesus came so that we might have life abundantly and the joy of the Lord. He came to set us free. So let's be people who bring our anger to Jesus and let Him heal it, knowing that in Him we have peace, forgiveness, and new life.